If you have been keeping up with modern comics, chances are you have probably heard of the name Ghost Machine. Whether it's by other comic YouTubers, or maybe you have heard of it in some conversation at your local comic book shop. Over the last couple of years, Ghost Machine has started to gain some attention, and while it is still quite niche, it has clearly started to take off and get some attention, with even a possible movie coming out. So, in conclusion, Ghost Machine has kind of become a big deal, and might be some of the most popular comics to come out recently. And as a huge fan of Ghost Machine, I am here to tell you why Ghost Machine is worth reading. In case you haven't heard, Ghost Machine is an imprint by Image Comics that kind of started because of Jeff Johns and Gary Frank, two popular and well established comic creators who are mostly popular for their work at DC, mostly Superman and as well as Doomsday Clock. It all started with a little series called Geiger, and at first, that was all it was going to be. A little independent miniseries where two people who already knew each other and have worked together decided to create their own comic. Not much plans of starting a separate company or anything like that. But, as it turns out, Geiger was pretty successful, and Jeff and Gary Frank liked working together and decided to create more comics. They would continue Geiger and even work on a little spin off called Junkyard Joe. And eventually, other comic creators like Brian Hitch, Jason Fabok, and Peter Tomasi would discuss about creating their own comics. And that was how it all started to form together. Originally, it was called Mad Ghost, but over the years, it became Ghost Machine. And over the years, Ghost Machine has been expanding, adding more legendary talent and telling a wide variety of stories. So, in a way, Ghost Machine has kind of become the next image revolution, where a bunch of creators who are well established at the Big Two gather together to create their own comics. And of course, like Image, is a company that creates creator owned comics that get to begin and end their comics when they want to. So Ghost Machine has kind of become something special. Not only is it fresh to see other diverse comics, but it has also shown that comics can be fresh and unique and be created without the big two. Well, as I already said, they are creator owned comics that get to begin and end their stories. So there is more of a creator voice behind it. And unlike Marvel and DC, there isn't a lot of versions of one character, but only one version of a character. One definitive canon version of a character. It's where one creator can decide where to take their story without corporate interference. And also, it isn't just superheroes. Well, I got nothing against superheroes, and as a matter of fact, I am still a superhero fan myself. It is still a joy to see fresh and unique stories that can appeal to anyone, depending on what type of genre you might be into. Whether it be historical, sci fi, post apocalyptic, family friendly, or even horror. There is a story for everyone. And Ghost Machine lets writers experiment with what type of stories they can excel at. And another thing to keep note of, it isn't just amateur artists that come from out of nowhere. Ghost Machine is full of some of the greatest comic creators in the 21st century. People that you have probably heard of if you already read comics, like Jeff Johns, Gary Frank, Brian Hitch, Peter Tomasi, Ivan Reyes, and the list just keeps growing. So, like the image creators, they are well established creators who have proven themselves that they can tell great stories, especially while working with the big two. And now it's an opportunity to create their own sandbox and see what more they are capable of. And I'm sure some of these names are enough to convince you to check them out. So, if I was able to convince you in any way to check out Ghost Machine, and you're wondering where to start, and what are some recommendations, well, don't worry, because I got you covered. There is, of course, the most important series, and the one that kind of started it all. And we wouldn't have Ghost Machine if it wasn't for this series. And that is, of course, Geiger. A story about a glowing man who tries to survive in a post apocalyptic future where a big war has happened and has changed the future. And other factions are trying to take over whatever land they could get, while also having themes about families sticking together during rough times. I've heard people compare this to Fallout, but it is still a good series that is still going, and Gary Frank's art is quite a joy to look at. For my next recommendation, and probably my personal favorite, is Redcoat. A story about, well, a redcoat who has achieved immortality and works as a mercenary and goes on adventures throughout American history. And even gets to meet famous American icons like Albert Einstein, Annie Oakley, Johnny Appleseed, and the list goes on. So, if you happen to love history, this might be a series for you. Also, one thing I should mention, Geiger and Redcoat happen to take place in the same universe, which is called the Unnamed Universe, a universe about unknown American icons called the Unnamed, who happen to be fighting the unknown war. That also connects other stories like Junkyard Joe, and more stories to come that flesh out this universe. So, this is kind of superhero adjacent in a way, and is meant to be like modern American folk tales similar to Paul Bunyan and John Henry. But it's not just the Unnamed Universe, as Ghost Machine has a lot of other universes, depending on each type of story and genre, that I will now mention next. My next recommendation is Rook Exodus, a story set in the far future about a guy who can control crows and has to settle on a waste planet, while also meeting other people who can control animals called wardens. A very interesting concept that mixes sci fi and Western. And also, the concept of people who could control animals is just a cool concept. And Jason Fabok's art is also just glorious to look at. Ghost Machine is just so fortunate to have a lot of great artists. Which brings me to my last recommendation, and that will be Hyde Street. A story about different types of people who make some bad and corrupt choices and end up in Hyde Street. And in order to escape, they would have to collect 10,000 souls for the enigmatic Soul Keeper. So this series is kind of like Twilight Zone and Tales of the Crypt, where each story is meant to have its own separate theme. I'm not a huge fan of horror, but this series quite surprised me by how interesting the stories actually are. And the characters are actually quite complex and interesting. There are a lot more that I haven't mentioned, and some that I haven't even read yet. But some other honorable mentions would be Junkyard Joe and the Rockefellers. But aside from that, I think the great thing about Ghost Machine is that there is a story for everyone. And I think Ghost Machine has the potential to be something big in the future. And it is great to see some of comics' greatest legends that have proven they can tell great stories now gather together to create their own comics.